all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Geek Audio podcast. Some Tassajara Stories. I'm DC Booba of Geek Audio and Geek Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So as soon as we've had our pause to meditate, we'll get into Tassajara Stories. So when you hear the bell, hit pause, if you wish, and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come back, hit unpause, and we'll be here to hit the bell to end the meditation or whatever, and we'll get going. Ihara. Herman Ihara, a leading spokesman for the Zen macrobiotic diet and philosophy, came to Tassajara. Loring and I wanted him to speak in the dining room to students. I wasn't as into it as Loring, but it would be a break in the routine. I went to Suzuki's cabin and said a number of students wanted to hear Ihara speak. He shook his head and said, "In Japan, we'd never do anything like that. We don't want other teachers to come in and speak at our temple. We're jealous, and especially from other sects or from outside of the sect. We think it will confuse our students. But this is America, so things are different here, so okay." Ihara gave a talk in the guest dining room. Macrobiotics was controversial. Tassajara's diet wasn't that far off macrobiotics, a diet based on whole grains and with brown rice king, cooked vegetables, miso, tofu, sugar was anathema. We'd have eggplant and tomatoes, but for the strict macrobioticists, they were out. To yin. The yin-yang balance was key. Some people couldn't stand the pickiness and thought it was all nonsense. A reporter from the Berkeley Bar was such a detractor. He said macrobiotics made people gaunt, picky, and rigid. He came to Tassajara, interviewed Suzuki, and told me he loved meeting him, but it was so frustrating that he couldn't get Suzuki to disavow macrobiotics. He even said, well, there's some overlap. Suzuki attended Ihara's talk and afterwards went up to him in the courtyard outside the dining room and greeted him warmly. Britt Pyland, who was standing nearby, said that in parting, Suzuki patted Ihara on the back and said, "Don't worry so much." And the night air of Tassajara absorbed everything, Britt added. Wood and Bones. J.B. Blunk was a wood sculptor who lived in Inverness, north of San Francisco. Met him through his neighbor, architect Sim Vanderen. J.B. worked with chainsaws and had large works at the Oakland Museum and Stevenson College at the University of Santa Cruz. Pieces a number of people could sit on. I treated JB and his wife Christine to a couple of nights at Tassajara. Abbot Richard Baker was enthusiastic about JB's idea to build a sitting area near the office. Big Creek Lumber was up Highway 1 at Davenport, just north of Santa Cruz. It was owned by Bud and Lud McCreary, two good, solid guys who loved the Santa Cruz mountains and were truly conscientious stewards of the woods from which they sustainably harvested 1% of the trees a year. They provided the San Francisco Renaissance poet, Brother Antonius, rent-free lodging in a cabin on their land. I took JB to Big Creek to see if they might have some logs he could use for his benches or whatever it was he was going to make for Tassajara. He had carte blanche. There was no plan. Bud and Lud took us to a special pile of fat, irregular old-growth logs with burls and twists. JB was in heaven and picked a bunch of them. The McCreary brothers came to Tassajara to check out the road. I met them as they arrived, and they were shaking their heads. No way their logging truck would do that road. But they knew a guy who might do it, a Yugoslavian who lived a ways north of Davenport in Pescadero. He drove in a rickety vintage pickup, didn't say much, ate lunch, and said he'd do it. That road alone took him 4 hours. I'd driven up to lead the way. Not that there was any alternative. That truck was so long, I couldn't believe he'd said he could make it. He couldn't go around any turn in one pass. It wasn't guest season, so he didn't hold anyone up as he negotiated hairpin curves by going back and forth many, many times. I took naps along the way and was sorry I hadn't brought anything to eat or drink. At least it didn't take him the 2.5 days it took Andrew Church back when his horse-drawn wagon hauled the 20-foot-long bowling lanes into Tassajara. JB came down multiple times and wielded his chainsaws and hand tools and grinders, and we got a unique sitting area among the sycamore and a few other places. There was one piece by the gate. There was another set of brothers. The Cummings brothers' sawmill was set back in a sub-valley on the west side of Carmel Valley. We got trees milled there, mainly dead trees we'd bought for practically nothing from the Forest Service. The Cummings brothers were a couple of strange, cranky old guys who sounded like they were from the backwoods of Kentucky, whereas they were born and raised in Mill Valley. I think their work and social life was mainly with each other, and they'd gotten fairly inbred in terms of their accents and attitudes. They both had limps. Lambert told me that one of them limped because of an accident that the other felt responsible for, and that he developed a sympathetic limp out of guilt. They'd cursed their landlord, Clint Eastwood, for being an uppity, immoral Hollywood star and driving a foreign car, not mentioning the $100 a month rent he charged them for that prime Carmel Valley land. They denounced the U.S. government, the deficit, and waste. Talk about the terrible waste they'd seen while serving in the Navy in World War II, where perfectly good lumber that had been used to stack shipments would be thrown in the water as dunnage when identical lumber considered part of the shipment had just been unloaded. Would stop work to listen to a Christian broadcast on the radio, one with his arm around the other's back. I'd watch one brother receiving lumber going through the saw and stacking it to the side while standing partly in a massive batch of poison oak. Said he'd been hospitalized with it when young and since then had been immune. They had an old logging truck they'd load up to 25 tons of logs, even though it had a 5-ton limit. Said the key was to drive very slowly over any bumps. Said it was the load going up and coming down that would break the axle. They told me that after having way overloading a truck, I was driving back into Tassajara. Having a custom mill that close to us was most useful and convenient. There are hardly any mills that are available to outsiders. They didn't like yard trees. Too much metal in them these days. Hit a spike and it can ruin a blade and send a dangerous fragment flying at lethal speed. Richard Baker tasked me with getting a stupa made for Suzuki to be set behind the large stone for him up on the hogback. In orthodox terms, a stupa is a structure that houses relics of Shakyamuni Buddha, like, say, a toe bone. There are more stupas for Buddha than he had molecules, but it's the thought that counts. We used the term loosely for the wood marker for Suzuki. Baker stipulated there should be a square shaft leading to 4 different geometric shapes: a cube, a sphere, a pyramid, and a piece in the form of a teardrop or a Hershey's Kiss. So first I got a couple of clear heart redwood, 8-foot long 8x8s, specially chosen by the McCreary brothers. Baker said the stupa had to be from one continuous unbroken post. Bud and Ludd told me to check out Job Dykegraph in Watsonville. Said he was a cabinet maker and had a long lathe. Met Dykegraph at his shop. I had a drawing. He showed me his lathe. It could turn pieces up to 17 feet long. He'd made a lot of columns for buildings, liked to do staircases. His specialty was circular staircases without any continuous vertical support, like a metal spring. Told me he'd done one like that with 3 spirals for a casino in Las Vegas. He said he tended to get unusual orders, but this one was the most unusual. Said he could do it. Dykegraph served a strong cup of coffee. He was Dutch, grew up on a farm. He was in his early 30s when Germany invaded. He said things were awful gloomy, looking pretty dismal, till one day the sound of distant engines in the sky grew louder. And from then on, the early morning sky was full of airplanes going in to bomb, and later it was full of them coming back. Some of them smoking, some of them crashing. Said they shot and killed the farmer next door and his 2 sons when they got caught harboring a downed flyer. Dykegraph came to America in 1957, bringing his degree in woodworking technology. He was a proud Union man. He did a perfect job with the stupa, made 2 of them as requested. I brought them in on the luggage rack on top of my Toyota station wagon. He tied them down with so few hitches, with so little rope that was not thick at all. I expressed concern. He said it couldn't be tied on any stronger, that the luggage rack might come off, but the stupas won't come off of it. Later, Graf came in for the day, checked out his handiwork, took a bath, left with a complimentary loaf of bread. Down at the baths one night after Zazen, I met some guests who'd come down there with their 3 kids from Inverness in Marin County. Sim and Mimi Vanderen. There were some other guests there with some pot who offered to share. I suggested they do so in their rooms, as the fire watch would be coming in soon. So we all went there. Sim taught architecture at UC Berkeley. His experience with private practice had driven him into academia because the first 10 homes he designed were for couples who broke up in the process. Said he didn't want to be a psychiatrist, too. He'd gotten radicalized from his experience with the student demonstrations to save People's Park back in the mid-'60s, when he'd become a liaison between the students and the administration. He gave me a copy of a little publication he and his students put out called Outlaw Builders News. There were photos of funky structures his students had built on his property. The next time Diane and I were out, we visited Sim and Mimi at their place, inspected those hobbit huts and their 2-story home, which Sim said he built without plans. He took us next door and introduced us to JB and Christine Blunt. JB was polishing up a long redwood burl table for an office in downtown San Francisco. Both of them had built compost privies, which were attractive and a vast improvement over an outhouse. They also functioned splendidly, I discovered by personally testing one. The compost they made from these privies was used to fertilize plants in their landscaping, not for their vegetable gardens. Jean de Schmidt originally came in as a guest and immediately went to work. He and some fellow carpenters artfully created a unique entryway area to the bridge to the baths with a shoe rack using wood he found here and there. He was the contractor for the new cabin that Sim Vanderen designed. I'd spent months working with Vanderen and our structural engineer, Jeffrey Barrett, and negotiating with Walter Wong of the Health Department to make Monterey County the second in the state to issue a permit to build compost privies. That wasn't easy. When I first met Wong, he was so hostile to the idea that he talked looking out his window with his back to me. He changed his mind after a trip to Tassajara, a carefully prepared proposal, and a meeting which included Vanderen, Barrett, and 3 others I'd met at Tassajara, the chief architect for HUD in the Bay Area, Sid Abrams, the head of vector control for the State Health Department, John Poorbaugh, and an executive from a major sanitary engineering firm. With Vanderen's expert advice, we built compost privies in the lower barn for those who stayed in the loft there, and the upper barn. Tim Buckley helped do the finishing touches. An important feature, which should always be used in outhouses as well, is a ventilation pipe, which would suck air down through the opening of the toilet seat so that the only odor was that of the sawdust used to cover the droppings. They were elevated with doors on the back lower chambers that we opened to transfer their contents to a covered container that was transported to Grasshopper Flats to the screened-in Stage 2 of the composting process. We wore gloves and took every precaution we could, but that didn't stop Jean's little son, Taro, from falling into the collection chamber one afternoon. Bill Steele, who worked with Jean, was operating a John Deere 310 digging up topsoil for landscaping on a Thursday afternoon when Jean yelled for him to stop and cut the motor. A skull had rolled out from the front loader. In an article for the Windbell, Jean wrote, "At about 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, a parade of vehicles swept into Tassajara. The sheriff, county coroner, the homicide division, archaeologists, as well as the news media. Cars and cameras were gathered, and the bones were spread out on the tailgate of a truck." Allison Galloway, a forensic anthropologist at UC Santa Cruz, determined the bones were from an Esalen Indian who died about 150 years prior. She said the teeth were worn down from chewing on acorns. Jean followed up with the sheriff's department and then the Native American Heritage Society, which connected him with an Esalen Indian named Loretta Escobar Wire. She came to Tassajara with her sister-in-law, Ann Cornelos. They had just come from a hearing in Moss Landing concerning another set of bones which were found at a construction site. Jean, Bill Steele, and a student named Barbara Cohn took them to the spot where the skeletal remains had been found. They spotted another bone. After a walk up to Suzuki's ashes site and a view of the waterfall, Jean took them down to the lower barn to show them the painting of the Indian legend which had once been a mural on a wood slab wall at the baths. It had been carefully removed when the baths were remodeled. It tells the story of a powerful Indian chief who was so favored by the sun god that he had psychic powers such as to hear grass grow and see game and enemies a day away. When his beloved little sister fell seriously ill, he decided to take her to the coast, hoping the ocean water would cure her. But when they reached Tassajara Creek, she became too weak to travel further. The chief was distraught, prayed to the sun god to save her, and offered his body. He fell to the ground, turned to stone, and hot tears issued forth. The sister threw herself upon her petrified brother and was bathed in his hot tears. She arose cured. Word spread of the miracle, and Indians from all around ventured for health and healing to the hot springs which flowed from where the chief had sacrificed himself. I always assumed that story was made up, till I read about the legend in Marilyn McDonald's scrapbook on Tassajara history. Now, available as A Brief History of Tassajara, from Native American sweat lodges to pioneering Zen monastery. The mural was created in 1958 by a waitress named Anne Marie Brunken. She'd gotten it from a poem she found in the Monterey Library, and then Loretta and Cornelos confirmed that it was based on an actual Esalen legend that they'd heard from their elders, though they said the details in the painting were all off and disagreed about whether it was hot tears or hot blood. Walking back from the barn, a golden eagle with a rabbit in its claws flapped up from the garden and flew off, passing right in front of them. At the front gate, Jean pointed out a cloud formation that closely resembled a skeleton. Loretta said she'd been dreaming of dinosaur skeletons. The Esselen Tribal Council had decided that the people of Tassajara were of good heart and that the bones should be reburied there in a ceremony attended by representatives of both communities. An Esselen named Todi arrived and chose a spot high above the baths. Jean wrote, Todi wandered about Tassajara for 3 days and found a reburial site up on the Overlook Trail. At the third switchback, there is an outcropping of granite rocks surrounded by 7 blooming yucca stalks with a flattened knoll protected by 3 oak trees. From this spot, you can see the place where the bones were unearthed, as well as all around Tassajara. Todi left a shopping bag of things he picked up as he wandered through the hills: cedar bark, stones, a shell, feathers, leaves, and river sand. He left a note entrusting me to make sure they went into the grave. Early Sunday morning, Loretta arrived with Charlene, the Wintu shaman. Charlene was about 5 feet tall, raven black hair down to her knees, a cigarette in her mouth, and a smile on her face. She walked up to the reburial site and sat alone for several hours. Jean and 2 students dug a circular hole 4 feet deep. Like the Japanese of old, the Esselen buried their dead sitting up. A dozen tribal members, Jean and 2 daughters, Tia, the director, and a handful of other students attended. No cameras or metal objects were allowed. Jean wrote, Charlene said that as she had been sitting alone here, she had seen and heard many happy spirits moving about, that this was a magic place, and that only joy and positive feelings should leave with us. Pulling out a Ziploc bag containing some mustard-colored ochre from a sacred spot in Northern California, she walked in front of us, pouring a continuous circular line around the grave. She asked that we all move forward to stand on this line, then that we hold hands and form a closed circle. We stood in silence for a few minutes. Then the bag Todi had left was opened. Feathers, shells, leaves, bark, and other things were placed on the bottom to line the grave. The lower extremity bones were carefully placed, and then the upper body parts. The skull was placed on top. Sand from the creek bank was sifted over the top. The Esselen were left alone to complete the ceremony, fill the grave, and cover it with rocks. Back down below, Jean looked up to see a golden eagle circling overhead, then flying off, passing over the gravesite, and the Esselen assembled there. This has been a Cuke Audio podcast. Some Tassajara Stories. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sonora with Doggett Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.